All right, everyone. And this is going to be part two of our use of the Kennedy assassination issues to see parallels in how events have been uh, arose in what we previously talked about, and then we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to show you what the Kennedy assassination issues have in common with the satanic use of Paul. And people say, well, what do you mean satanic use of Paul? Well, I'm saying that Paul was a patsy, manipulated to take the fall when he would be exposed. And he was exposed and he took the fall. It's just our history books have erased that. But Paul's Jesus got Paul to pretend to the apostles he converted. This is obviously clear in Acts 21. We'll take a look at it in a second. When he secretly played the destroyer of the Mosaic law in Galatians 3:19 and 4 verses 8 to 10. So the apostles have no idea that Paul's first epistle, 47 AD, had staked out Paul's view that the law given Moses, all of it, all 5 books, were given by angels and through a mediator Moses, and was not given by God at all. And why do these stupid, foolish Gentiles, Galatians, want to be obedient to the weak and beggarly celestial beings? That's the word it really means, not elements. Celestial beings, and be in bondage again by observing Sabbath. Sabbath. That's what it was. Days, and seasons and months. He calls it days, season. You want to observe all these things, and and it was given by these weak and beggarly celestial beings to Moses, the mediator, and therefore he's saying it wasn't given by God. He was the destroyer of the law. That was what his mission was from his Jesus. You've got to get rid of that law. He was an enemy of the same Jesus of the earth, but he didn't know the doctrines of Jesus of the earth. He only knew the doctrines of the Jesus he was getting to. And he says so in Galatians. He says, I didn't want to know anything. The apostles imparted nothing to me, the 12 apostles. And I got all my messages from Jesus, in the ascended Jesus. So he thought he had a superior way of getting information, and it made him the patsy of when the fall would happen. And it did happen. He did fall within the apostles deemed him a false apostle. And we covered that where Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, says that's exactly what happened, arising out of the events that we see in Galatians chapter 2, which ties it all together. So anyway, let's compare this then to Oswald. And what we recently found is amazing new revelations just a couple days ago. We'll expose to you what that was. And finally, the story has really been resolved. And in fact, it's clear now what was going on, and we didn't even understand it completely last time. So Oswald clearly was a patsy to be set up as a fall guy to avoid exposure of the true culprit or culprits. And so this I'm calling part 2. I just want to show you what the first part was. And what our first part was is what did the Kennedy assassination issues have in common with the rise of Trinitarianism in 325 and 381 AD? And what we said basically is there was a whitewash of the Warren Commission in the Oswald case, because the way they explained Jack Ruby's role was that he was so sad that his president had been killed. This petty criminal running a nightclub, a sleazy nightclub. This is the guy who's going to step forward, and he's going to kill and assassinate the president. And supposedly that's what his emotions were. He was just feeling so remorseful that we'd lost our president that he had to go kill the assassin. No, and he never said that himself, ever. Never. That just simply was something the Warren Commission made up completely to misdirect us, because the Ruby is the problem to the standard narrative, because it does not fit at all. Anyway, so then what's the parallel in the rise of Trinitarianism? Well, it was the Nicene Conference. It was something that had to be depicted other than what it was. Oh, it was a voluntary conference. 250 people get together. Only two dissent, and there was no coercion. Ignoring the fact that it actually was 5 people refused, and those 5 people were banished outside the empire, which is a death sentence in the era of Rome. If you had to live in what was called Northern England, where the Visigoths are, and all these, basically, you can't live. You will be dead within a couple of years, because no foreigners are allowed, basically. So yeah, to be exiled is just a death sentence. So that's not free will. That's coercion. And then Arius was the one who got blamed for everything, and he was banished to another section of the empire, and all his works were destroyed and burned and banned, and anybody who possessed them was subject to a death penalty. So these are the free will decisions of the Nicene Conference, just so you know. All that happened at the Nicene Conference, and those things are downplayed or ignored or just simply whitewashed and just pretended as they never happened. And anyway, and then Arius gets blamed for the non-Trinity view, for a non-Trinity view, even though he cites Colossians 1:15-17. So even though he is basing it on Paul, so you would think that if Paul's inspired, they should have obeyed. Paul says Jesus was what? The first begotten of creation. Okay, now whether that's true or not is not the point here, but it clearly he's not a god. If Colossians 1 verses 15-17 are true, of course, no Trinitarian will tell you that Paul contradicts the Trinity doctrine right there. So I have to be the one to break the bad news to Trinitarians that if you believe in Paul, you can't be a Trinitarian. Okay, so but I'm trying to show you a different issue about Paul. So Arius gets exiled, and all his writings are destroyed, and all his followers, if they possess any of his writings, will be killed. Okay, that's just simply how you solve a problem where you get a disagreement. It's sort of what we dealt with in the Warren Commission report. But now I'm showing you, that was part one. Now we're going to go to the part two, which is different. Okay, now I just want to show you how Satan was using Paul unwittingly. And this is, again, a patsy means somebody who's taking on a role, thinking he's protected, and he's never going to be shot down for this position because of who he's tied to. Now, we're going to find out who Oswald was really tied to. There is an explanation now of everything. And it came this week from RFK Jr., and the son of Robert F. Kennedy, and his uncle was President John Kennedy, and he was 10 years old when this happens, apparently, or in that time period, apparently. And he's able to tell us what was said and done inside the family, and who his father thought killed his brother. So anyway, so as I say here on the left, Paul sees God Paul to pretend to the apostles he converted, Acts 21 verses 21-24, when he secretly played the destroyer of the Mosaic law in Galatians 3:19 and 4 verses 8-10. So Galatians is 47 AD, and the events of Acts 21 are virtually about 10 years later. So Paul had kept it a secret. All these writings were not known to the 12, but they're going to learn about them, and they're just heard the rumor of what's going on. And that's first happens in Acts 21. What he really believes, they've heard rumors of it, but they want him to prove it isn't true. The rumors they've heard. And so this is what James, the bishop of Jerusalem, the blood brother of Jesus, says to Paul. And they, the apostles, are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to apostatize. That's the word in Greek, apostasia. Apostatize against, not the word forsake as the King James has, Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to work after the customs. Well, of course, Paul said there's no more Jew or Gentile. He himself says in 1 Corinthians 9, he's no longer under the law himself. That means anyone who's a Jew belongs to a race whose ethnicity is no importance in determining the law of God applicable to them. And now it's simply just like Paul. I'm no longer subject to the law. But I'll act and pretend as if I am around those who think the law still applies. And that's what he says in 1 Corinthians 9, by the way. So he plays the chameleon, and he defends it. So he doesn't hide his behaviors. He just tells you it's a good thing to lie for the gospel. He says that in Romans 3:7. If by my lie the gospel is advanced, why am I still called a sinner? So 1 Corinthians 9 has to enlighten you who are Paulinists how to read Romans 3 verse 7. But I digress. Now we're continuing. This is James. What is it, therefore? So basically saying, what should we do? This is James saying, the rumor has happened that you have apostatized. You're an apostate, which would mean what? Paul's subject to a death penalty. If you said the law of Moses in any particular way is not applicable, for example, it wasn't even given by God to Yahweh to Moses, which is what Paul says in Galatians 3:19. The law, he says there, was given by angels through a mediator. And why do you want to be subject again and be in bondage again to these weak and beggarly celestial beings? That's the word in Galatians 4 verses 8-10. Anyway, so what are we to do? the multitude must needs come together. So this is Pentecost. They're all coming together. There's going to be a lot of people around. This is important. For they will hear you have come. So he's talking about the people who are hearing this rumor and have told them this rumor that he's against the law. What are we going to do? We got to prove that you're not against the law. What are we going to do? Verse 23, do therefore this what we say to thee. Doesn't even want to hear what he has to say. He's telling them what you're going to do. We have 4 men who have a vow on them, and it's going to be the Nazarite vow when you read the next paragraph, and that's from Numbers chapter 6. So verse 24, them, these 4, take and purify thyself with them. So he's supposed to do exactly what they're doing, take the same vow to the law under the law, and be at charges with them. So pay their way. There's a fee that at the temple for doing all this stuff, that they may shave their heads. So they get their heads shaved and they fast for a period of time. And all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee, this apostasy that they've heard that you're apostate, that you've taught people not to obey God's law anymore, are nothing. Read that again, ladies and gentlemen. All may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing. So James is saying you have to prove to people this is all a lie against you. And how do you do that? You do what we're going to tell you. And what's the consequence? But thou thyself also walk orderly and keep the law. So he is definitely telling Paul, whatever we've heard has got to be a falsehood, right? And you've got to prove it to us that it's false, or else you're an apostate and you are not an apostle of Jesus Christ, which is what's going to happen later. And that's what the Bishop of Ambrose, when we have this all documented, concluded that Paul was, that the 12 had concluded Paul had gone beyond the teachings of Christ and had violated the commandments of Jesus and was a false apostle. Okay, and that was in Ambrose of Milan's commentary on 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 2. And it wasn't translated from Latin to Greek until what? 1999, did not become even repeated by anyone until 2006, which is where I saw it in Meek's book. And then I went and did my own research. I actually found that he left out 3 words in the translation. So I went back to the Latin to retranslate it. And what it actually says is that Paul, the 12 had found Paul was not teaching that Paul was teaching not consistent with God's law, and therefore they concluded that he had gone beyond where he should have been. He was a false apostle, and this arose due to a scandal that had broken out with the 12, and that then is referenced again by Ambrose in chapter 2, verse 11 of Galatians, and that all had to do with Paul saying that Peter had been a hypocrite, had earlier been eating with the Gentiles, and now he wasn't, and Paul didn't have any explanation. He pretended he didn't know the explanation for why Peter didn't do that. Well, we know that secondarily from sources, the recognitions of Clement, that he could not eat meat sacrificed to idols. Therefore, he wasn't going to eat with them when they're eating meat, which in those days would have always come from the market and always have been already sacrificed to the idol before you even buy it at the store. It comes that way. It comes pre-sanctified by demonic spirits. So he's not going to eat that food, and that's what the law says you can't eat it, and that's why Balaam was executed, even though he was a prophet of Christ. Balaam in 1250 A.D. is BC is contemporary of Moses. He gives the blessing over the people of Israel. The Holy Spirit comes on Balaam. Balaam gives the famous star prophecy of Jesus Christ coming with the star sign in the heavens, and he will be one day the ruler of the world. That's who Balaam is. And yet, despite all of this fact that he was a prophet of Christ, he had the Holy Spirit. He taught it was okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and Moses had him executed. And Jesus is blessing that in Revelation chapter 2. He mentions this whole story. And then Jesus in Revelation chapter 2 commends the church at Ephesus for finding those who say they are apostles but are not, so they're false apostles. And then he condemns, unequivocally, Jesus condemns those who teach it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which, of course, Paul twice in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10 says it's just perfectly okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. The only time you refrain is if you're around somebody who has a weak mind and they think there's something about an idol that could actually contaminate you or communicate a demonic spirit to you. Don't worry about that. It's okay, and don't let your conscience be guided by them when you're not around them, but only when you're around them. Just refrain in front of them because they're going to do something they think is wrong, but is perfectly fine. Go read it if you don't know what I'm talking about. So That's what happened, and that's what Ambrose documented. So now let's show you how what happened to President Kennedy was a very similar event to what we see here. So, in other words, Paul was being used as a patsy of Satan to get rid of God's law, teach to Gentiles. It was done away with. And if you look around, Christianity today is just almost a foregone thought. Like anybody would say that you have to follow the 10 Commandments are just Looney Tunes and crazy people. Even though Jesus quotes it in Matthew 19 as the way of salvation. How do you get to salvation? The guy asks him, he says, well, Jesus says, well, obey the commandments. And he starts rattling them off. And the man says, well, I've already done that. And so you see, but this is just, we're told the opposite, that Jesus was anti-law, that he was just pretending to be pro-law. That's the only way some people can reconcile it to. But the truth is this, the 12 understood, and James is showing you here that they all understood the law was to continue. There was no such thing. And the Gentiles had a very limited set of commands, and they gave them a few, and then said, hey, every week you're going to learn more. You're going to go to synagogue. You're going to go to the temple services. You're going to hear the word, and you're going to learn the commandments that do apply to you. Some commandments do apply to the sojourners and foreigners, the Gentiles. So in the end, Paul does get blamed for his views. He thinks it's from the Jesus of the ascended Jesus. He doesn't know it's got to be who we all know it is. What have we proven? Could Jesus have agreed in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, that Paul should not be released from a torment of an angel of Satan? That's what Paul says. Jesus told him, I'm not going to release you from a torment of an angel of Satan. That's what it says in Greek. You have to look at the Mount C reverse interlinear to see the words angel, angelos, satanas. An angel of Satan. Jesus says, you know what? I'm going to leave you subject to this angel of Satan because you know what? In your weakness is my strength, and you're going to learn to be humble. You're going to learn to be humble. And then Paul goes on to say, after he tells me this, I have to just boast in my weakness. Now he tells you. So he can't even be humble about being put in this position. He has to boast now about being so loved by Jesus that he would leave him subject to a torment of an angel of Satan. That's literally what he says in 2 Corinthians 12:7. How can that be Jesus Christ? To leave somebody subject to an angel of Satan? And the only other thing that I have to say is there are many things about the first appearance on the road to Damascus where Jesus quotes the play of Dionysius about a dying and resurrecting pagan god, a son of God named Dionysius. I mean, come on. Why would Jesus quote a pagan play about that? Just kind of sick. But put that to one side. But it's in Acts 22 when Paul says, when Jesus came to visit him in a trance he's having while he's praying in the temple, he's directly come from Damascus all the way to see the 12 apostles. He wants to repent to them. He tells his Jesus in this trance, he says, I told him, I said, I want to go repent to them. And he keeps telling me, they won't believe you met me. Leave immediately without seeing the 12. And they're only like 25 yards away. In the temple, he's praying, and they're on the portico, Solomon's porch. That's what the Act says, and that's what the historical records of the church says. They're right out there outside, and he's doing nothing to go talk to them because his Jesus is afraid something's going to happen to Paul if he goes out there. Why couldn't his Jesus go talk to them and say, hey, here I am. I'll appear to you. If I can appear to him, I appear to him in trances. I appear to him in an appearance on the road to Damascus. I'll appear to you guys too, and I'll convince you that he really met me. But his Jesus says, no, they won't believe you really met me. So leave. And he does. And he tells this story to a whole crowd of people in Acts 22, Paul does, and he thinks that he's so gullible, he doesn't realize that can't be Jesus. Jesus if he's this miracle worker who showed up on the road to Damascus, if he's a miracle worker, he can be in your head and talking to you, then he surely could get out of your head and do what he did at Damascus and appear to the 12, 25 yards away. Why didn't you even think of that, Paul? Because he's extraordinarily gullible. A lot like this Patsy, which we're going to see. It was a guy named Oswald, and he was hired to do a job, and he assumed what he was doing on that day in the book repository, even with a rifle, was for a purpose other than what he understood it was to be. That's all I can tell you. He was the patsy, but he thought he was doing it for some other reason, and they misled him. So we're going to hear now the other side of the story, where he also was being manipulated, just like Paul was being manipulated by his Jesus, a phony Jesus. And again, Same thing's happening with Oswald. He's being manipulated, and that's why Ruby is killing him. It's to cover up what we could not directly hear anymore now from Oswald. So let's listen to what I said last time about Oswald, and then I'm going to show you a clip from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which will solve all mysteries about the Kennedy assassination when you hear it. So I don't know that we know there's any connection with him and the mob, but some people say that. So, but this is the argument, and here's the argument. Ruby, in any literature of this period, Ruby at most rates as a footnote. And that's a code word for telling you, the reader, just ignore this guy's role in history. Because, if you think too hard about it, you might ask yourself, how could Oswald be acting alone? Or if he's the guilty party, how could his death just be an act, coincidence that somebody would come in and risk his life and be guilty beyond guilty? He's on camera, he's on video, he's killing a famous person. He has no chance of escape. He will be himself sentenced to death in the electric chair in those days in Texas. This is like the most insane place to do this. It was literally like throwing your life away by killing this guy there, but you were doing it because of something else, maybe big cash payoff. I mean, he does hang out with those kind of people. He lives on that kind of life. And they call it a moment of insanity. So in other words, you and I are supposed to believe that there was nothing he was trying to cover up. He wasn't trying to protect somebody from being exposed through something that Oswald would say. And now I want you to listen. We're going to listen to Oswald a little bit, because it just tells you, when you just listen to him, he is adamant that he had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. As they're walking him through the police station, he says, I don't even know why I'm being arrested. They've not told me yet why I'm being charged. And I believe it. Nobody wants to tell him anything. And they won't let him have an attorney. Think about that. There's something wrong in this arrest sequence, and the defendant is not acting like a normal defendant, which is, if you're guilty, you don't speak. He's acting like he's truly innocent, and he's speaking up, and he's saying, I don't even know why they're arresting me. Tell me, please, somebody tell me. And he's doing it on camera multiple times. So we'll take a look at that.
People have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything. I didn't shoot anybody.
Has any identification been attempted for the killing of the president?
Not yet.
I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for.
You have a lawyer?
No, sir, I don't. I'd like some legal representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People
How'd you get the black eye?
Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man! Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I live in the Soviet Union. I'm just a Patsy.
It was a calculating man who slew the president of these United States today. He had to be.
I really don't know what the situation is about. Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a police chief. I know nothing more than that, and I do request for someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, we ain't here.
Okay. What did you do in Russia?
A policeman hit me.
In Dallas, the prime suspect still is being questioned. He is 24-year-old Lee Oswald of Dallas, a former Marine who spent some time in Russia, who at one time had applied for Soviet citizenship. He has been associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Shooting himself, and Dallas Police Chief Just Curry describes him as a stoic individual who admits nothing. He believes he's being held because he once lived in Russia. Oswald, who said 2 years ago he wanted Russian citizenship, was fined $10 recently in New Orleans for distributing communist literature. He's married to a Russian woman who was brought to the police station with their small daughter and his mother, who lives in a Dallas suburb. She was also questioned and said, "I am heartbroken about this. He is really a good boy." Oswald's only comment to the world at large since his arrest has been a denial.
Appeared at the police station during the night carrying a small child. Oswald married her in the late 1950s when he was in Russia trying to renounce his American citizenship. Mrs. Oswald, who speaks only limited English, seemed stunned by all that was happening to her and her husband. Police said she told them that her husband owned a gun matching the description of the one believed used in the assassination of the president.
Here comes Oswald down the hall again.
Did you find that rifle? Just as fast as you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
Oswald has hustled through a doorway. He says he has nothing against anybody. He has not committed any act of violence. Oswald makes this claim as he's hustled from the interrogation room through a doorway, down an elevator, up an elevator.
I've been photographing the teacher, now they're taking me to line up among these men. That will be kicked out. Right?
Oh, God, we got to indoctrinate these guys.
Okay, now I think it's very revealing that it says he's going to be held as a patsy, meaning he understands that, somebody has now mentioned to him the president of the United States has been killed. He knows he's applied. You're going to learn in a second. He's applied for citizenship in Soviet Union. His wife he married is from the Soviet Union, and I looked today through some of the records that have been released recently, and they just show he's seeking to emigrate at about this time back to the Soviet Union, where his wife's family is, and no big deal. I mean, there's nothing out of the ordinary, and even we have all these intercepts of the messages between him and the Soviet embassy and the Cuban embassy, and they're all we're listening in on their communications, and we're typing them all up. And they're having no familiar conversations about anything that could associate him with assassinating the president of the United States. So this is what I would conclude. Okay, and the other thing is, if a person is guilty, they're going to clam up. They will say nothing until a lawyer is present. I think even then they knew that. He's asking for a lawyer. He's saying at first, when he's arrested, the only thing he says, "I've been told that I shot a police officer and I haven't done that." And then he still doesn't know what the charge is, and he says, "Well, these reporters told me that supposedly the president of the United States has been shot. I know nothing about that either." So the frankness of the way he's speaking is important. And I just want to say that's why there's always two sides to every story. That's why you have to have trials, because the things that you can't see on a piece of paper is the emotion between of how someone says something and whether it sounds credible or not. And it actually sounds completely credible to me that he did not have anything to do with it. And I don't care about this thing. And I've never watched these videos for all these years. And I haven't even seen the Oliver Stone movies. I don't follow the Kennedy assassinations. It's just, I'm trying to use, what if this was true? What else is true? So in other words, it'd be easy for me to say, well, then Ruby's going to kill him to cover up something that he and Ruby are involved in. But what rather it seems to me is this man knows something whoever wants him dead needs to destroy. So here's what I say. We know he did not kill. We know that Ruby isn't killing anybody in a moment of insanity. He's a regular person. Now that means we know Oswald was killed to silence him because of something, because his testimony could hurt the guilty in one of either two ways. One, Oswald could exonerate himself, and thus the true killer must be caught. So one thing is, if people can pin the blame on Oswald, then the case is closed, and you don't need to find anybody else. You put it on the Patsy, you get him tried and executed, and you're done. And if he doesn't know who killed him, that would be to your advantage. But he may very well have a good idea of who would be involved in trying to kill the president. Or two, Oswald could implicate himself in a deal. So let's say Oswald did shoot the president, but let's say people are paying him to do it, or he's doing it with other more powerful people that the government would rather get them instead of him. He's a small level person, and maybe he didn't even shoot the trigger, because I mean, there's all kinds of arguments about how can anyone shoot from that book repository. It'd be a 1 in a million shot. He was trained to be a shooter, but even the best shooter can't count on that shot at that point, and from that range, and from that height and that angle, and to a moving car. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. You'd be better off to pick a much better angle. I mean, I'm not a shooter, but that's what they say. You should have had a much better angle. So the second option is he could implicate himself in a deal to let the government find someone else more guilty, liable. So there were strategies that he would have used that by killing him, they no longer exist. So the way to analyze things and think like a lawyer is, if this was really Oswald acting alone, why in the world would Ruby have killed him? So the answer is he wouldn't. He in this case, he's not insane. He's not a Kennedy aficionado. He's not a political. Ruby is not a political person. So Ruby is simply acting on behalf of somebody who wants to see Oswald dead, because he's talking already. He's on video camera. So you got to see those videos that I just showed you now. They're out there for at least 2 days. And that's when Ruby acts. So he can see that Oswald is talking and chatty and doesn't seem afraid to talk to anyone. And he doesn't have an attorney yet. And so this attorney's not going to, until he gets an attorney usually gets to know the truth. So this first thing that your client usually tells you is, if you're a criminal attorney, I'm sure, well, here's what's really going on. Because if you don't tell your attorney, he can't really help you. So this is what would be the danger. If he gets an attorney, the attorney's going to know the truth too. And by the way, that's whoever's involved. Let's say the state somehow is involved, the state of Texas. I don't know. If they were involved, they don't want to get an attorney, because that attorney is going to learn this. And now the truth can't be suppressed. So whatever's going on here, abnormal behavior. Police are not giving the guy any attorney. And in a most high profile case there can possibly be, the shooting of the president of the United States, no attorney. You're denying him right to counsel. It's a guarantee in our Constitution. It's been affirmed by the Supreme Court just before 1962. I mean, come on. This is not. We have moved beyond the 1860s. So this is a bizarre set of circumstances. And so I just say this: ask yourself, if Oswald acted alone, never had any complicity with anybody else, then nobody else would have ever had any motive to shoot and have him killed. Therefore, that since somebody obviously asked this petty little guy who never shot and killed anybody in his life, we want this guy eliminated. Can you get it done? You have an in at the police station. You're the station snitch. So you can get in there, you can get in the crowd, and they'll not think you're anything at risk, and you can shoot him. And he says, sure. And the thing that's interesting is Ruby knew exactly how to shoot him. Shot him on the right side, which is the left side, meaning where his heart is. So shooting him on the right side up into the cavity was a death shot. So that was a very calculated shooting. It was an execution is really what it was. He had to shoot to kill. He couldn't just wound him. That would do no good. He had to be dead. And he gave him that fatal shot. So that's what I conclude from that video clip, that this man likely was innocent. I know it sounds crazy, right? But it sounds like he's completely innocent. And even if he weren't innocent, he's completely chatty. And if you were the guilty party and he had a co-conspirator, you would be worried as heck that this guy's going to talk, because he doesn't seem to have any common sense to keep his mouth shut. And but to me, getting back to my view, if he were guilty, I mean, the reason I can't believe he's guilty is he's not keeping his mouth shut at all. He wants to be heard. He wants to be talking because he realizes something big is happening, and he may be blamed for something he didn't do, and better keep talking. Better keep proclaiming your innocence, or you're going to be railroaded down, how people get into hysteria. He sees that's going on. It's already a mania. I mean, that's not the calmest situation you've ever seen in your life. So he is fighting for his life by telling, I think, the truth under the circumstances of extreme pressure. I mean, he is under extreme pressure that this is basically a mob. So he, now if he said I killed the president, that'd be a whole other thing. Of course, I guess he could be afraid there too. But in this situation, he's also literally being put under a vice. So anyway, that's how I view this arrest and this situation. So it's very much like what will the government have to do now when the evidence is conclusive, and it is, that there was a conspiracy of some sort. We just have to find the bad guys who did it. Or do we want to whitewash this and say he acted alone, which is the Warren Commission's final conclusion? Well, we needed, for the peace of the country and maybe for other political reasons, we didn't want to expose anything, so we just chalked it up to what was this. The report of the Warren Commission was that he did it on impulse and out of grief. In 1964, that was the Warren Commission's report. Jack Ruby, did it out of grief for the President of the United States. Pretty amazing conclusion. Okay, so now that's what I said in January of 2023, before what RFK said just a couple of days ago. We're going to RFK Jr. And now I just want to show you how I analyzed the shooting by Ruby, and you can see the police are conniving. It's obvious this is a setup to get him shot. And you say, oh, that's conspiracy. Just watch and pay attention to what's really happening when Ruby gets access to walk right in front of Oswald and just shoot him point blank, and nobody stops him. When that's the whole point of how he came out and what was supposed to really be happening. So just take a look at that. And what makes this interesting is that now we have certainty of what was going on because of what RFK Jr. said this week. But here, I'm just using common sense, and that's what very important is to have some common sense. And people who don't watch this event with common sense walk away saying, "Oh, it doesn't mean anything." Watch it with common sense, and we'll talk about that next. I'm going to now show you Lee Harvey Oswald being assassinated on camera on national television at point blank range. So what's going to end up happening with the killing of Oswald is it's going to be a textbook setup, just like it was with Serpico. Here's a guy who been doing informing for many years against the cops, and now they're going to set him up. He's just he sensed it was coming. Two guys he doesn't know are signed on a case with him, doesn't know them, but they know him, but he doesn't know them. Cop 1 and 2 say, hey, let's go up there and you make a buy and we'll arrest the guy for buying drugs off you. Simple, easy. Serpico has to be unarmed and he has no weapon because he's the one who's the buyer. He can't be inspected and be found to have drugs on him. So he's got to play the role to the end. So cop 1 and 2 are right there, right next to him. Now, all they need to do is get him to get the door open, and they're promising to rush in. What do? They stand back, and they let him get shot in the face. That's how you get rid of the guy you don't like. How do you do it with in the case of the president? You've got to get the shooter so close that he can make a deadly shot on one try. He cannot fail. He has to be right up against the guy. And we're going to play for you actually the clip of the medical surgeon who was in charge of the surgery, and he explains where the entrance wound is in the upper abdomen, left side. Where's your heart? So the shot was exactly right into his heart cavity, fatal, and the doctor says it's a fatal wound. But you need to hear it because it's the key evidence of why. And then when you see the video, you can just see it's a Serpico killing. It's a setup.
He never regained consciousness at all. In fact, before surgery, we had no blood pressure, a few agonal respiratory efforts, and that was all. During the operation, once we got control of the major vessels, the aorta, the vena cava, the kidney injury, we had a blood pressure for a time, but then we had the cardiac arrest, which was obviously incident to massive blood loss, the anoxia that had occurred. This was again a fatal wound that he received.
Was there ever any chance for him to recover?
Well, there's always a chance as long as you have signs of life, and we had at least a heartbeat preoperatively, so there was a slight chance. So we.
What was your impression when you first saw him, though? Did you have any hope on your first impression for recovery?
Not much, although again, there's always a chance. The course of the bullet wound through the upper abdomen was such one could feel the bullet under the skin on the right side, the entrance wound in the upper abdomen on the left side. We've guessed that he had injured all the major vessels in the between space, and sure enough, he had.
Okay, and the next point of reference and a obvious setup for an execution right in front of your eyes is, look at this scene. The car is going to pull up here on the left. I have the arrow pointing there. He's only got to go about 15, 20 feet. The detectives are all lined up in plain clothes on this side. You've got this one journalist here, and you have the mysterious killer standing right next to that person. So what's the job of the people to get Oswald from that building into that car at all costs, meaning in normal police activity with an assassin of the President of the United States with international affairs affected? I mean, you can't let this guy get killed. You've got to defend his life with your life. And now watch what happens.
Get the mic.
Okay, I just want to freeze frame it there for a minute. So now we have a last-minute guy whose job, what is it, to check that you have credentials to be in this area. So we would keep everyone out of the area except maybe this one media reporter. But everybody else goes. And a nightclub owner, the last person on earth we want here. Get out of here. There's no reason to have him there. He can't do anything except kill the person who just killed the president 2 days earlier and silence all the evidence that goes with him and put him into his grave. That's the only thing that can go wrong here. Get this guy out of there. That's the only thing that should be in this guy's head. But no, he's acting like there's nothing, no big deal. I don't care about that guy. I don't care about a guy who's running a nightclub in the middle of nowhere and is our snitch with criminals. Well, he hangs out with criminals, and that's what we depend upon him to be in touch with criminal elements. This is the right guy for me to leave right here in this spot. Just, I'm going to act like I don't notice him.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
This is the basement floor of the Dallas City Hall, and that's a scuffle on the basement floor. It seems to concern photographers.
He has been shot. Oswald has been shot.
Lee Oswald.
Oswald has been
We're
shot.
going to switch now.
Police.
Okay, and since I once had to hire a bodyguard when I went to court one day for entry, just so I wouldn't get killed, and I can just tell you, you need to make sure the guy who's protecting you is between you and the shooter. So the guy with the white hat is supposed to be the main guy protecting him. He's on the wrong side. He's got to be on this side of Lee Harvey Oswald, not on the side where the other detectives are. Do you think the other detectives are going to shoot him? No, you're worried about somebody in this direction going to shoot him. But no, nobody's, look at all the people on the other side. They're looking at the car that's coming in. But the guy who's supposed to protect him is on the wrong side. Your defender has to be on the front of you so you can't be killed. That's the whole point. And that's the whole point of this whole charade of bringing him down here in the garage. If you want to have him killed, just walk him out in the front of the building or do this. Pretend that you're protecting him and then do exactly what they did to Serpico. Just stand back enough that they can get a clear shot, no interference whatsoever, and kill him. Because this was an execution right in the public's face. And it's just such an obvious thing. It's just too obvious to believe that nobody ever... I've dissected this scene, and if you just know any elemental ideas of how to protect someone in police custody, it is not standing on his wrong side. And you don't let the public, you don't let petty criminals right in front of you to be within this distance from this guy to the assassin of the president of the United States 2 days earlier. They think we are fools, and yet this is done right in front of us, and nobody says anything. Nobody even points to the most obvious facts. They're all looking at the shooting of the president. This is the shooting. This is the shooting. You have it on tape. You know exactly who did it, what happened, and what wasn't being done to protect the defendant, who had never been actually giving any legal counsel. He was trying to get legal counsel, and they denied him that, which might have protected him from this fiasco. So there was a whole sequence of things where this department was setting him up. And if you think police departments can't be corrupted, you don't understand the Serpico case. And the Serpico case is 2 lessons in one. How can police be corrupted? And how can you set somebody up for murder and you're a cop? And you'd say, oh, cops don't do that. Well, I'm going to tell you, the man who was supposed to be guarding him virtually admits what he did. So look at the shot here, by the way. I mean, point blank range. James Lavelle is the cop right there, the homicide detective. Do you think he's actually studying the face of this man? He can see the gun. He's taking no defensive action for his person he's supposed to be protecting. Very strange. Don't you think this behavior is bizarre? And the New York Times, in this article, this guy dies not too long ago. He had a stricken glower. What does that mean? It's like, oh, I'm surprised that somebody's trying to shoot my client here that I'm supposed to be protecting. Now, what's that about? Well, let's listen to what he himself records this, and this is in the New York Times article I just found there. Moments earlier, he, Lavelle, and Mr. Oswald had an eerie exchange. Mr. Lavelle often later recounted. Lee, meaning he's talking to Lee Harvey Oswald, Lavelle is, he recalled saying, if anybody shoots at you, I hope they're as good a shot as you. Now, in a joking way, he's saying, I hope if they try to shoot you, they don't shoot me. Well, see, that's the whole problem here is your job is to get shot and him not be shot. That's the idea of being in police custody. You are now responsible if that guy gets shot. In essence, theoretically, you could lose your job if he gets killed, right? And more importantly, the national security depends upon we getting an investigation of what happened with this guy, and he's declaring he didn't even do it. So what's really going on here? He's telling you, I wanted him to get shot, not me. That's all he's telling you, which that's why he's not defending him. Is that why he's standing back, pretending like he had no assignment to protect this guy? And look at the proximity of Jack Ruby, and he's shooting him right in the left chest. He knows exactly where he has to go. He's getting it right up against his chest. He's already fired it. So the sound has gone off. And this guy over here, Lavelle, is just, he's not even frightened. He is not even frightened. It's like, my good buddy, take care of your job, then I'll grab you. But you got to get this done. Boom. So right at the very moment, you can see the culpability of the detective himself. He is guilty as sin. That is not the look of a man who is worried, has any concerns he's going to be shot. Do you see any fear on his face that this man's going to shoot him? Not the slightest fear. In fact, he looks like he's almost smiling. Take a look at the reaction. People cannot lie under stress at this point. I mean, they're the last thing they think is they're going to be shot in a photograph, a perfect photograph of the very moment the gun is right in this guy's chest. And you will be shown how poorly you protected this man. I mean, poorly isn't even the word. It's no protection. And there's another guy to the right of him, but he doesn't seem to have any authority in this situation. This was his task, was to walk him out. And you can even see they're having a conversation back and forth. But he's standing on the wrong side. He should have been between him and this guy, because all the other detectives are behind on the right side, right arm of Lee Harvey Oswald. They're on the wall. This side is the side that needed protection. The side that was exposed to whatever the police, not the police, the press bay there. There was one man there, but there seemed to be a little bit of license there that there could be people other than the police. So there's that reporter, in fact, the news station that's broadcasting this live to the entire country. So this is caught on camera to the entire nation. And I actually remember watching this as a child. I was a kid. I was cleaning the house. I saw the assassination 2 days earlier. we were all glued to our TVs for days, and you were waiting to see he's going to be taken to the criminal defense building and whatever. And this is what you then all see live. This is unbelievable. But it was not what it was never told to us what's really going on here. No one's ever dissected this. And it's so obvious when you just dissect it. And sometimes things take time. This photograph is something that, you have to see to make the whole picture fit. And then this tells the whole story right in one shot. All right, now we're going to take a look at a video interview by Russell Brand, a famous movie actor. I think he lives in the UK when he's doing this interview of RFK Jr. Very excellent, complete synopsis by RFK Jr. And he's running for president, so that's why he's getting media attention. But it turns out what he had to say here is very very shocking, and yet at the same time, he knows intimate facts, intimate details from being the son of Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and he also knows his uncle, and they all are a big family, and they all know each other. So that adds to a little bit of the verity, if you will, of how I would interpret what we're hearing. Okay, so let's listen to this interview.
What? JFK was murdered by the CIA, allegedly. His nephew says so. We had a fascinating conversation with RFK. He's an unstoppable force. He's running for the presidency. You might only know him as an anti-vaxxer because surely the mainstream media will never talk about him in any other terms. But when you look in depth at what RFK is saying, what RFK believes in, what RFK has experienced as a member of the greatest dynasty in American political history, let me know in the chat. He talked to me about the Bay of Pigs, the JFK assassination, that it was sort of basically definitely the CIA, that KGB spies used to go round his house, CIA killed JFK, powerful things, and in this conversation, we get right into it. Stay to the very end, you're going to love it. Let me know in the chat and the comments what you think. So, Robert, what do you feel about that sort of rather broad and potentially incendiary, and I hope not offensive question I was asking about the family members who most of us believe were murdered by the CIA?
Yeah, I mean, my uncle, came into office. He had been a military, he had been a skipper of a PT boat during World War II. He had the kind of the enlisted man's scout, although, he was a low-level officer. He had the enlisted, but he had a kind of an independence. He had his own ship that, and was destroyed by a Japanese destroyer, but he had the enlisted man's skepticism of the upper brass. And when he came into office, these guys who were running the Joint Chiefs at that time, Louis Lemitzer and the other ones, whose names he knew as an enlisted man and who many people respected, but he was skeptical of them from the beginning. And he also was very conscious of Eisenhower 3 days before his inauguration, which I attended as a little boy in Washington. Eisenhower gave one of what we now should regard as probably the most important speech in American history on January 17th, which was my birthday when I was 6 years old, warning Americans about the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would corrode and devour our democracy from within and without, the institutions of our democracy. It would turn America into an imperium abroad and a security state at home. And Eisenhower warned specifically also, when he defined military-industrial complex, he included the federal scientific technocracy. It's a really fascinating speech in that way. My uncle was very aware of that. 2 months in, he's surrounded by people. Of course, Nixon had planned the Bay of Pigs, and nobody knew about it. They had, almost 2,000 trained Cubans who intended to invade Cuba, but they waited. The Eisenhower-Nixon administration had waited to dump that project on the next administration. And so my uncle was surrounded by an intelligence apparatus and military. His Joint Chiefs were saying, you got to go do this. And my uncle said, wait a minute, why are we invading a sovereign nation and a little nation? We're going to look like bullies to the world. And, I don't want a Marxist country there, but that's their choice. This was before there was Russians there. So it was just a nation that had made a political choice, in his view, that we didn't like. But he also was very conscious of the abuses of the Batista administration that Castro had revolted against. And he later said that, sent a note to Castro saying that, oh, they were saying, we're going to invade. And Jack said, I don't want any U.S. military involved. They intended originally to use military amphibious vehicles and transport. And Jack said, you're not going to use anything from the U.S. government. So the CIA then went to United Fruit, and they provided the ships for the flotilla. And of course, United Fruit had owned all the sugar cane in Cuba. So it was, again, this kind of merger of state and corporate power that, and Dulles had represented United Fruit as a lawyer for Sullivan Cromwell before he got the CIA job. So it's all this kind of incestuous stuff that continues to infect and dictate policy at the CIA. But they said, listen, and Jack said, are you sure this is going to work? Are these guys just going to die there? And they said, no, as soon as they land, we've done all the intelligence. There's going to be a public uprising against Castro, and he's going to, and the public will depose him, and, these guys are going to be heroes. And Jack was very skeptical, didn't want to do it, but they said, we've trained these guys, they're armed. If you keep them here in Miami and Louisiana and Texas, it's going to be a nightmare. You got to let them do this. So Jack let them go. They get to the beach, and all of his Joint Chiefs come to him with Allen Dulles and said, they're dying on the beach. You got to give them air cover. And Jack said, no, I told you there was going to be no U.S. military involvement. And those guys, some of them died on the beach. The rest were captured by Castro. Jack came out of that meeting, and he said to his aide, I want to take the CIA, shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. And he fired Dulles, he fired Charlie Cabell, and he fired Richard Bissell, the three top guys in the CIA, and he brought in somebody, John McComb, who he thought could run the agency. But the next 3 years, the next 1,000 days before his death were a constant battle with his military-industrial complex. And interestingly, Russell, he realized in the middle of his presidency that Khrushchev was in the exact same position as he was. Khrushchev had fought in World War II, had been at the Battle of Stalingrad, had seen the horror of war, did not want to go to war. But he was surrounded by military hawks and intelligence apparatus that did want to go to war. And my father got a letter one day, a private letter that was smuggled to him by a KGB spy and a GRU spy called Georgy Bolshakoi. And Georgy Bolshakoi was a guy who came to our house all the time. We loved him. We knew this was when James Bond movies were coming out. And, me and at that time, there were 8 or 9 or 10 of us, my siblings. We all knew, we knew about what a spy was, and we were very excited that this guy was actually a KGB spy, and he was very entertaining. He could do that, Russian Cossack dancing, and he would do rope climbing contests with my father and push-up contests, and he was kind of a bonhomme, really a fun guy, always laughing, very loud, singing, all this stuff. So he became friends with my father and mother, despite the anger at the State Department for letting a KGB guy into our house. Khrushchev began smuggling private letters to my uncle through Bolshakoi. So he was trying to end run his military intelligence apparatus. And my uncle began this correspondence, 26 letters they wrote to each other. And they installed hotlines so they could talk to each other directly without talking to their apparatus. So in my brother's home, which used to be the Summer White House on Hyannisport, there's still wires sticking out of the wall. That was the red phone that we all knew when we were kids, that if we picked that up, Khrushchev would answer on the other line. And my uncle wanted to talk to him directly because he did not trust his intelligence agencies. And his intelligence agencies tried to get him to go into Laos. They said, the communists would be a domino effect, and he refused, and he settled the Laotian War. They tried to get him to go into Vietnam to send combat troops, 250,000 combat troops. And it wasn't just salad brass, as he called them, the top brass with all the salad on their uniforms, what he used to call them. It was it was people he trusted like Maxwell Taylor and Averell Harriman and Dean Acheson and all these people who were kind of the graybeards, and they were all telling me, you got to send 250,000 people in or the communists are going to take over Vietnam, and then they're going to take over Cambodia, and then it's going to be Los Angeles. They're going to be at our door. And my uncle was like, that's their war. They got to fight it. We can help them a little, like the French helped us during the Revolution, but we cannot fight their war for them. And so before he died, he ended up sending 16,000 military advisors to Vietnam. That was fewer people, fewer troops than he sent to Jackson, Mississippi to get one black man, James Meredith, into Ole Miss. He sent more federal troops there than he sent to Vietnam. The troops he sent were not combat troops. They were military advisors, mainly Green Beret, and they were technically, under the rules of engagement, not allowed to participate in combat. He didn't want any combat troops. A week before he went to Dallas, he heard that some of his troops had been killed over there, and he asked for a casualty list. And his aide brought him a casualty list that 75 Americans had died in Vietnam. And he said, that's too many. And I want them all home. He signed that day a national security order, ordering all the troops out of Vietnam, all military advisors out of Vietnam by the end of 1965, with the first 1,000 home the next month. This is the end of November. He wanted the first 1,000 shipped home by the end of December. This shocked the military. And then he went to Dallas and he was killed. But, my uncle used to say, Ben Bradley, his best friend, asked him, what do you want on your gravestone? And he said, he kept the peace. He said, the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep our country out of war. That is the primary job. And he succeeded in doing that, but no president since him has.
Wow. Bobby, how can you say, though, that it's beyond reasonable doubt that it was the CIA just because of because he sacked some high ups, because he was gonna dismantle it, or at least he had an intention to, because he was at odds with the military-industrial complex? And if that is true, do you suspect that in other high-profile assassinations there was a comparable structure behind it, including obviously the assassination of your father? And also that if this is, sort of 70 years ago or whatever, how entrenched are those 50? How entrenched are those deep state interests now with the war, with the current conflicts that with comparable motivations? And do you not feel that this is, when you have access to sort of like this kind of personal information, do you not feel that this is an indefatigable enemy, that this is an unstoppable machine? I mean, like in this country, when like Jeremy Corbyn got a little bit of traction, like the media just shut that dude down. I mean, he couldn't get arrested. How can you speak out openly against these kind of interests, let alone try and mobilize a political movement and stand against them without serious fear of, assassination?
Let me answer the first question. Your first question was, why do I say that the case against the CIA in terms of the assassination of my uncle is beyond a reasonable doubt? The answer to that would take us a 10-hour podcast to even summarize, because the amount of information is so voluminous at this point. There are more than 1 million documents, including all the documents that show that Lee Harvey Oswald, that they recently released, which we already knew, but it came as a shock to the United States because the president never reports it. And Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset. Americans didn't know that. Certainly the Warren Commission didn't know that. And Dulles made sure that they didn't know it. He was recruited when he was at the Atasui Air Force Base in Japan. He was a Marine radar operator who was in charge of the U-2 flights. And then he defected to the Soviet Union. It was a fake defection that was organized by James Jesus Angleton, who was the director of counterintelligence at the CIA. And it was directed to uncover a mole at Langley. They knew they had a mole at Langley. And that mole, incidentally, was never caught. But that mole did tremendous damage to U.S. national interest. And one of the things that mole did is it allowed the CIA believe that the U-2 flights were CIA. They weren't Air Force. And the U-2, the CIA believed that when Khrushchev shot down one of the U-2s in May of 1960, right before the election, the one where Gary Francis Powers was the pilot, and that U-2 flight was shot down. The Russians were able to do that because of information that were passed on to the Russians by the mole. So they got Lee Harvey Oswald to defect, to do this very, very loud fake defection that was covered in all the papers then, because it was a U.S. Marine walking into the American embassy and denouncing his citizenship and saying he wanted to be a citizen of Russia. So he does all that. And then what they thought is when he did that the Russians would be very worried about who is this guy. And they would send a message to their mole saying, get us his file. And they had a trigger system on his file, so anybody who touched it, they'd know that that was the mole. But nobody actually went in and touched it. And so 2 years later, they brought him back. And he, in this weird situation where Lee Harvey Oswald goes back to the U.S. Embassy from which he's defected and says, I want my passport back. And they give it to him. And can I borrow $600? They gave it to him for an airplane ticket. They sent him to Dallas, where he's picked up at the airport by George Morenshaw, who's a CIA asset, and then, who gets him the job at the book depository, among many, many other things. But we know everything about what Lee Harvey Oswald was doing at that period and before and after. We know his constant interactions with CIA handler. His CIA handler was a guy called David Atlee Phillips. I've talked to Cuban assassins who saw Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas in October of 1963 with Lee Harvey Oswald. But Lee Harvey Oswald then did this, somebody did a fake defection of him to attempted defection to Cuba. We know so much about it, including confessions of many of the people who were involved in the assassination. Deathbed confession of E. Howard Hunt, for example, who then went on to mastermind the Watergate, break-in, and many, many others. So at this point, the evidence, and by the way, Russell, if you ever, or anybody who's listening to this, want to read probably the best distillation, the best digest of all of this material, a guy who's completely encyclopedic command of the material and is a really rigorous scholar, Jim Douglas, and he wrote a book called The Unspeakable. I think it's the best book written about this, although I've read probably 40 or 50, maybe 100 books about, the assassination stuff now, because once I started looking into it, I was interested in the evidence that the CIA killed my father is much less, is not that well documented, but it's very highly circumstantial. And I'll get to that in a second, but I will tell you this one thing. I guess I was almost 10 years old when my uncle was killed. And I was standing in the White House in the foyer of the White House with my aunt, Jackie Kennedy, and my mother and my father. My uncle's body was in the East Room, and it was the time when we were waking him. And Lyndon Johnson comes in and tells my parents that Lee Harvey Oswald just been shot and killed. And that the man who did it was a guy called Jack Ruby. And I said to my mom, I turned to my mom at that time and said, did he love our family? In other words, was Jack Ruby killing Lee Harvey Oswald because he was upset, about our family? And so at that point, like many Americans, was asking questions because this didn't look right. Lee Harvey Oswald was a gangster. He did not like my family. And I mean, Jack Ruby was a gangster who didn't like my family, who was, my father's initial reaction when his brother was killed, the first call that he made was to the CIA desk officer in Langley. And he said to him, did your people do this? Then he called up. The next call was Harry Ruiz, who was a Cuban refugee who I knew well, who was a constant fixture in our household. He had been at the Bay of Pigs. He had fought side by side with Castro and the Sierra Maestre. After they all came back from Mexico, he was an engineer. He had been very close to Castro, then turned on Castro when Castro went communist. He was a very close friend of my father's. And by the way, I've talked extensively with Castro about all this stuff too. So, but my father called Harry Ruiz and said to Harry Ruiz, did your people do this? Meaning the Cubans. Because the Cubans at that time had turned on my family and hated them and felt they were traitors because they had not rescued them at the beach. And because they had ended the raids by Alpha 66 and the other groups that were raiding Cuba all the time. So the Cubans were very angry at my parents. My father thought, and they were all linked with the CIA. My father thought maybe that the CIA had done it, maybe using Cubans. And then the third conversation he had that morning, I had been brought home from Sidwell Friends School when my uncle was shot. And I arrived at the same time John McComb arrived at my house, who was the director of the CIA at that time. And my father brought him for a walk in the yard and said the same thing to him. Was it the CIA who did this to Jack? So, my father's first instinct, which was a good instinct, it turns out, was that the CIA had killed his brother.
Well, there you go. You're a little bit older and wiser now, having listened to Uncle Robert Kennedy's fireside chat of home truths about the deep state and globalist corporatism.
And in case any of you are thinking you can poo-poo any of this, or what he said, actually, we have the official conclusion of the United States House Select Committee on Assassination's chairman, after doing 2 years of investigation by Congress, 1976 to 1978, and they concluded there was a conspiracy. They were led to accept the idea that conspiracy could be based upon the acoustic evidence of motorcycles. And I'm going to put that to one side because allegedly subsequently that has become cast in doubt. But what is not cast in doubt is what we're going to now read from the chairman of this committee. So this was the United States House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations, established in 1976 to investigate the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 and 1968, respectively. The HSCA completed its investigation in 1976 and issued its final report the following year, which concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of conspiracy. So let's now read where the real conspiracy happens. Is the cover-up is still going on while this committee is trying to investigate. Wait till you hear this evidence that RFK Jr. didn't even mention, just to show you how deep this goes. I'm going to read this in full, so bear with me, and it'll be informative. I'm sorry. Let's go back. Robert Blakely, the chief counsel of the committee. Did I say chairman? I'm sorry. The chief counsel. So he's the lawyer for the committee that we were talking about, the House Committee on Assassinations. He later changed his views that the CIA was being cooperative and forthcoming with the investigation when he learned that the CIA's special liaison to the committee researchers, George Johannides, was actually involved with some of the organizations that Lee Harvey Oswald was allegedly involved with the months leading up to the assassination. So the guy that they put in charge of dealing with Congress turned out to be somebody who was working with Lee Harvey Oswald in the months leading up to the assassination. This guy would have a personal reason to cover it up. He could have been directly involved. Well, what's interesting is wait till you find out what Lee Harvey Oswald was also involved in. Because remember, when you listen to what RFK is saying is that Lee Harvey Oswald was likely at one point a very conservative Marine, and he's trying to do this for patriotic reasons. He's willing to pretend he's a communist and all these other things in order to help his country. That's what he's told. So he's going to join the Marxist committee for this and the Cuban committee for that. But look at what this says. So what did the Robert Blakely find out? Among these organizations What organizations that Lee Harvey Oswald was allegedly involved with in the months leading up to the assassination included an anti-Castro group. So Lee Harvey Oswald apparently is really privately working with the anti-Castro group, while publicly and so other people can see he's a pro-communist. But in his private life and in relations with this guy, he is an anti-Castro person. And it was called, this anti-Castro group was called the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, which was linked to the CIA. So there's where you have, if Oswald's involved with this anti-Castro group, then and it's a cutout of the CIA. Well, that tells you how and where Oswald is in contact with what he believes is the real movement, is an anti-Castro movement. He's just pretending to be a communist and handing out leaflets and getting fined and all these other kind of things. Okay, Johannes was in fact working for the CIA in 1963. Chief Counsel Blakely later stated that Johannes should have in fact been interviewed by the HCSA. So the very guy that is being their liaison turns out to have known Lee Harvey Oswald, would be an eyewitness to say, hey, what's going on? And then why is Oswald involved in an anti-Castro group called Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil? Right? Wouldn't that make sense? All right, let's keep going. So Blakely later stated that Johannes should have in fact been interviewed by the HCSA rather than serving as a gatekeeper to the CIA's evidence and files regarding the assassination. So he's saying, hey, Johannes, you're the good guy. Just give me whatever I need to know about what the CIA knows about Oswald. And he's trusting him. And now he realizes later this guy was keeping a secret from him that he's directly involved. If there's a cover-up, who better than put in charge of gatekeeping is the guy who would be directly involved with Oswald doing anti-communist things. All right. He further disregarded and suspected, so this is Blakely, and suspected all the CIA's statements and representations to the committee, accusing it of obstruction of justice. That's a crime. Blakely saying you were obstructing our justice. We were trying to find out the truth, and you, CIA, were obstructing us, and you put in charge of your gatekeeping a guy who was involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in an anti-communist group. We figure out later that would have told us, wait a minute, this guy isn't a diehard communist. He's working with an anti-Castro group. That's his private life, apparently. In the same 2003 interview, Blakely issued a statement on the Central Intelligence Agency. I no longer believe that we were able to conduct, this is a Wikipedia, by the way, which, comes from usually a liberal left position. So I'm going to take it that this is like they have to concede this type of stuff. I no longer believe that we were able to conduct an appropriate investigation of the CIA and its relationship to Oswald. We now know that the agency withheld from the Warren Commission the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. Had the commission known of the plots, it would have followed a different path in its investigation. So let me just suggest this, is now that they know there is some link between the mafia and Ruby, right? Then you can put two and two together, is Ruby is working to help the mafia cover up the dirt of their role in trying to overthrow Castro to help the CIA. So CIA is turning to our underworld to help us to do overthrow Castro. And so that would be very material evidence and would have taken what Blakely is saying. The committee would have taken a different attitude of where we should investigate. Let's continue his statement. So this 2003 interview, Blakely. The agency unilaterally deprived the commission of a chance to obtain the full truth. Unilaterally. There was nobody else who was doing this. They were unilaterally obstructing justice, which will now never be known. I pray to God that isn't true, but actually RFK Jr. is telling us the truth now. Significantly, the Warren Commission's conclusion that the agency of the government cooperated with it is, in retrospect, not the truth. And that means a lie. We also know the agency set up a process that could only have been designed to frustrate the ability of the committee in its 1976 to 1979 to obtain any information that might adversely affect the agency. So what he's saying is this agency, the CIA, had set up a process that was designed to frustrate the ability of the committee to obtain information that would have reflected negatively on the agency. So they are hiding. They're self-protecting themselves. They're not trying to protect the FBI, by the way. So this is solely an CIA operation to assassinate the president of the United States, is what RFK Jr. said. And what is all the evidence you're looking at right here on the screen at Wikipedia? Why would the CIA be covering up anything? Why would they cover up the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of an anti-Castro group called, I'm going to repeat it again so you can't forget it, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. So all this stuff about him marrying a woman and Russia and all this stuff was designed to make the Russians accept him as a defector, because they wanted to, what RFK Jr. said, is to trigger the mole inside the U.S. government to try to find out, hey, who is this guy? We've never heard of him on our side, on our side of the equation. He claims to be a pro-communist, and so let's find out more about this guy who wants to help us. And so that would be a natural inclination, and they could ask somebody, hey, go find his file with the U.S. government so we can see who he really is, okay? And that was all set up to trap the Russians, and then that would tell who was the mole. Didn't work, but you can see that makes sense, right? Let's keep reading. Many have told me that the culture, this is Blakey again, many have told me that the culture of the agency is one of prevarication and dissimulation, and that you cannot trust it or its people. Wow, that's saying a lot. That means they're just all liars. There's no good part of them. Period. End of story. I am now in that camp. So he's come to that conclusion. That's how bad it was. I mean, it's just like he didn't see any good in what they were telling him. They were all lying to him. Now, according to a 2015 Politico report, newly declassified documents show that the CIA director John A. McCone, which, by the way, that was mentioned by RFK Jr., hid evidence from the Warren Commission. According to a once secret report written in 2013 by the CIA's top in-house historian David Robarge, the CIA admits McCone and other senior CIA officials withheld incendiary information from the Warren Commission. Incendiary means can burn our house down, can burn the CIA down for what we were doing in the JFK assassination. I mean, so RFK Jr., he is telling us apparently the truth, and the truth is proven by this, because this doesn't, again, if the CIA had nothing to do with it, was not a co-conspirator in killing the president of the United States in retaliation for his not supporting them and their agents and the people they had recruited to overthrow Castro at the Bay of Pigs, those people died on the beach. They felt betrayed. And I'm going to tell you a personal story. My dad was a U.S. Marine, and I remember when this happened, and I'm 4 or 5 years old, but I do remember him even saying it years later. He tells me he believed that the CIA had killed the president because, in the way my dad put it, my dad was a Republican, very conservative, trained us to be anti-communist in my little household that we lived in. And he said because Kennedy was killed because everybody hated him in the United States. And I go, what do you mean, Dad? Well, he had let down the people of the Bay of Pigs. And so everybody, distrusted him. And he thought he was a communist and was helping the communist. He was a communist sympathizer, and they wanted to see him all dead. That's how my dad perceived it. Now, of course, that's very, very much politically, through a political filter. And I'm too young to know whether, anything about stuff like that. So you take what your dad tells you. So I thought, well, Kennedy must have been hated. And so, he got what he deserved, is what you're being told. And he was fighting against our enemies. And so, he was helping the enemy. So he deserved to be killed. Do you see? And just so you know, that's my dad, who doesn't know. He's not part of the CIA. He's just saying, I don't want to say he was saying it was the right thing to do, but he was implying that if it was what they believed was true and why people hated him, that's why they wanted to see him gone. And so it didn't make certain people sorry to see him go because of what happened in the Bay of Pigs. And so you grow up in the United States, and if you're a kid, you don't understand it. An event like the Bay of Pigs, a failure like that, with the CIA trying to do an operation after it loses the air cover at the last minute from the president of the United States. There's going to be no air cover. You're going to go to the beaches. You're going to be shot to smithereens. And if you do it, you're taking your own risk. But, Kennedy said, I'm not going to risk any lives, any military intervention here. It's an independent country. We respect the sovereignty of other countries. So he left them all to die on the beach. And I can see why they'd be angry, but they should also look introspectively, like, you don't operate foreign policy. You are an agency of the president of the United States. If he's telling you he doesn't want to do something, you don't do it. All right, so now let's get back to our main point. Now, what did we establish about Oswald? He's clearly a patsy, and he was set up as a fall guy. Probably didn't even pull a trigger. Probably wasn't even in that nest. Probably was somebody else. Again, because of the way he acted completely innocent and like he didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And if I recollect, there's a lot of evidence that he was talking in the lunchroom at the very moment the shooting took place. So he wasn't even at the window. But that's a whole nother thing. But obviously, we don't know the whole story. We'll never know that part of the story, whether he was or wasn't involved. But I don't think we have reasonable doubt to believe any longer he was directly involved, or we cannot prove it. But we can actually see that he was a CAA cutout, and as a result of that, that means he's serving the CAA, and that's what he thinks he's doing. He had to pretend to be a communist in order to avoid to create this a reason that a mole might come out and say, "Hey, let's go investigate," his real file. But his real file would have indicated that he was actually a anti-communist himself and belonged to an anti-Castro group. And okay, so anyway, that's the end of that. So a patsy means somebody who is pretending to be something he isn't, and it's a very risky game because one side, people he's opposed to is who he's trying to betray. So he's pretending to be part of groups in order to betray those groups, betray that movement. That's a very risky thing to do, isn't it? Well, if you look at what Paul's doing, it's the same thing. He is pretending to be a Christian in the sense of a Jesus follower when he's following a different Jesus, the Jesus who's this ascended Jesus. And I believe it's sincere. That's the interesting thing. I don't think it's made up in his mind or he's concocted it because it's such crazy accounts of like I said, in Acts 22, and then in his 2 Corinthians 12:7, where his Jesus won't release him from the torment of an angel of Satan. All of these things are so hard to believe. If you really think this is the real Jesus, how can he be a person who won't release you from an angel of Satan? How can he be a person who doesn't think in Acts 22 that he can convince the 12 that you ever met him? And it's better to just leave without seeing them. His Jesus tells him in Acts 22. Go look at that. It's really astonishing. So he is being set up to be, he's being told by his Jesus, these 12 believe in a different Jesus. He's a Jesus who believes the law continued, but I'm telling you, Paul, that it was given by angels. It was they're weak and beggarly elements. There's no need to follow Sabbath. This is all a concoction of these angels, and they're weak and beggarly, and it's slavery. And the true freedom is to get away from reading the letter of the law. I mean, so it's completely satanic, but Paul doesn't know that because he doesn't know the Bible as well as you think he does. And so he's able to be taken in completely. So now what Paul is doing, he's playing a dangerous game. He knows he's opposing the 12. And that's why when he's asked in Acts 21, verses 21 to 24, you know what? We've heard your rumors that you are guilty of apostasy against Moses. And you can prove to everybody that's wrong by doing this ritual vow from the book of Numbers, which he then does. He takes several of the guys to the temple. So you have to understand he exactly follows through. So he is willing to put on a false face, pretend, just like Oswald pretended to be part of the pro-Castro, pro-communist movement. He's pretending to be on that side. And what's the problem with Paul pretending to be pro the Jesus of the earth instead of pro the Jesus of heaven, who allegedly has a completely different view than the Jesus of earth? How's he playing this game where he has a totally different Jesus from the Jesus of the 12? How is he going to win this game? He's got to play it out in Acts 21 continually. He has to pretend to the very end that he is a follower of the Jesus of the earth when he knows he isn't. And he holds a different view, and he'd already put it in print 10 years before the event you're reading in Acts 21, verses 23 to 24. So again, to reiterate, what was Acts 21, verses 21 to 24? That's where James, the bishop of Jerusalem, comes up to Paul and says, they, the apostles, and I have been informed of you that you teach all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to apostatize against Moses. That's a criminal death penalty offense under Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 to 10, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. And yes, indeed, Paul says that there is no more Jew or Gentile, and he himself says in 1 Corinthians 9, he's no longer under the law, but when he's around those who think the law still is in existence, he acts like he is under the law. So this is how it's called tactical evangelism when you study the rules on that. And even the Catholic Church called it casuistry, which is the use of fraud in order to advance the gospel. And they concluded it was justified based on Romans chapter 3, verse 7, because Paul says that exactly. Anyway, so James gives him an emphatic instruction, do therefore what we say, and why will that be? And by doing that, all may know that these things there, but whereof they were informed concerning you, are nothing, but that you walk orderly and keep the law. And Paul succumbs and he says nothing. And you and I both know that is a fraud on James and the 12, because we've read Galatians chapter 3, verse 19. The law is given by angels. Later in chapter 4, verses 8 to 10, he says it's weak and beggarly elements. Why do you foolish Galatians want to be subject again to the weak and beggarly elements of this universe, right? So we know he is putting on a fraud on these people, just like Lee Harvey Oswald had to pretend that he was a communist. Paul is pretending to be a Jesus follower, the Jesus of the 12 follower. And he knows he isn't, because he has a completely different Jesus telling him a totally different message, but he doesn't think it's worth telling the 12 anything about it. He's keeping it silent from the 12. So who is he truly trying to evangelize? He knows he's free of the law. He knows the law was given by angels, but he's not going to tell the 12. What's going on here? He doesn't have the guts of his convictions to say anything. He does exactly what Lee Harvey Oswald doing. He's acting as a secret agent to fake out the 12 apostles. But it doesn't work. Jesus helps them. And so eventually they come around to realizing he's a fraud, and they find him a false apostle. So says Bishop Ambrose of Milan. And we know separately from Eusebius and Irenaeus that the Ebion, which is the name of the apostolic church at Jerusalem, they concluded Paul was a what? An apostate. The same word you're reading in Acts 21, verse 21. We have heard you have apostatized against Moses, right there. It's apostatized against Moses. Apostasia is the word. Look it up in Mouncey's reverse interlinear at BibleGateway.com if you don't believe me. That's the word. And so they have found him to be an apostate, and that's the finding of the early church. Now, of course, all of this is Eusebius and Irenaeus say that, but they don't tell you or remind you who is the Ebion. They just don't mention who they were. They were the original apostolic church. And even Jerome says so in his commentary on Galatians. All right, everybody, I hope that helps us see that there is the Kennedy assassination is a object lesson that keeps giving all the time, because it's just such a reminder of what we would have to call fraud and pretense and charlatanism. And even Oswald played that game. And I have to tell this to all the CIA agents out there. It's a dangerous game. You yourself can then be set up, because nobody knows but you that you're playing a double game. And when you get exposed, you can end up like Paul, being branded a false apostle and an apostate. And that's what they did to him. But then the deep state was so deep, eventually later in time, in the Christian sense of a deep state, they reversed history and they covered it up. So Eusebius' mentioning of the Ebion isn't detailed as it could have been, and didn't say it was the apostolic church. Same thing with Irenaeus. Maybe the documents were changed so you couldn't see it was the original 12. The only thing they missed was Ambrose. Ambrose was in Latin from the 380 period, 350 to 380 period, and he said the 12 apostles found him, Paul, a false apostle, over a scandal, and he was referring to the Galatians 2 chapter 2 verse 11 scandal. Evidently, when you read the two passages together, and that escaped their notice because that's not been published from Latin into English until what, 1999, got no attention and no traction until it was republished in 2006, and then that was done in a more extensive commentary, quotes by Bray, and then Bray's work was repeated by Meeks in his work in 2009, I think it was, and I found it in 2012, 14, I can't remember. But eventually I publicized it and have made it more well-known. And I just did recently Only recently did I find the Latin original text, and there are 3 words that are missing, even in Bray's translation, and they say that Paul was found a false apostle because of a scandal. And then when you cross-reference it, you'll see it's Galatians 2:11. There's other words that then Ambrose uses in commentary on Galatians 2 verse 11. So this is just simply there are so many parallels between what happened to Paul and what Oswald got shot for it. He was set up and killed as a patsy, so he could be silenced. Paul couldn't be silenced, and he got exposed, and the church thought it won the victory, but later the Paulinists took over and hid a lot of this evidence. And it sounds like I'm telling you stuff that of course, if this was all what Doug is saying is true, wouldn't we all know this? Well, I've just told you why you don't know it, because we're all hidden away in the Latin texts that weren't revived until almost less than 20 years ago. All right, God bless everybody. Ciao. Take care. Bye.